Hello my lovelies, hope you've all had a good summer. I thought I'd start with a new series of videos for AQA Paper 1 and 2 for GCSE English. So today we're looking at Paper 1 and I'm going to give you 20 tips to really help you smash those top grades. So these 20 tips, they're kind of arranged in order and hopefully there'll be things that you'll also have been practicing in class. So number 1 is related to the fact that on the question for question 2, so commonly known as the language question, you get the text reproduced for you on the question. And you can really use that to help you get better marks. So you're going to need a highlighter or just even your pen. And we're going to look at two techniques called broad brushstrokes and narrowing down. So we're going to look at that in practice here. I've taken an extract from the sample materials that were published about 3 years ago from Jamaica Inn. And you can see that I've used my highlighter and I've highlighted loads of stuff. That's my broad brushstrokes. That just means I've highlighted everything I think I might possibly ever want to talk about that might be useful. Because I'm a bit of a worrywart. I don't want to commit myself at that point to, like a grade 9 would, to just chasing down 2 or 3 quotations. The broad brushstrokes are really good for helping you identify everything in the text, because the problem for many candidates is that they only look at things that are in the beginning. Now that's great. I could go with shaking, trembled, swayed, rocking, like a drunken man. I could probably go with those 4 quotations and that would be enough. But it runs the risk that I'm going to miss something by the end that might also be useful. And to be fair, this passage is probably longer than most of the ones that we've seen in live marking. So that gives us a little bit more to go with. But broad brushstrokes help me identify everything that might be useful rather than just targeting at the beginning. When I narrow down, I'm looking for those really juicy quotes, the quotes that I can really squeeze a lot out of. And by juicy quotes, I just mean when you mark a set of exam papers that candidates have written, you realise that they keep focusing in on several keywords that really help them get to the top marks. And candidates at the bottom end tend to use quotes that don't come from that group. So they tend to use quotes that are not actually that helpful compared to the better candidates who are actually picking out probably from about 5 or 6 quotations across the whole passage that are really quite useful. So narrowing down is also the step that you need to take, because you've got 8 marks, that's 10% of this 2-hour paper to do in about 10 minutes. So you really don't have time to write a book, which I could probably quite easily do just off those 3 paragraphs. So broad brushstrokes just means highlighting everything, and then you narrow down, kind of picking out between 2 to 4 that are going to really help you write about language in the exam. So here's my narrowing down. I've gone for, and you can see I've then started to look at what I've got, and I've gone for groups. So I've got shaking, I've got trembled and swayed, and I like that similarly like a drunken man. And then I've got creaked and groaned at the end, because I think the cumulative effect of all of those verbs together just shows how powerful the wind is. And also then I've got a range. Now I'm also, at this point, I'm going to have to sacrifice, and that's hard for kind of like the grade 6 to grade 8 students, where we really don't want to sacrifice a quote that we think, oh my word, what if that's the important one? So that can be really hard. And for instance, I really like that phrase, dispirited horses plodded suddenly. I really like that. I feel like I could get my teeth into that phrase, but at the same time, it's not quite as obvious, and I think I would really struggle to explain myself in the short time that I've got available. So highlight, use that passage that's in front of you, get into your broad brushstrokes, and then narrow down, pick out your quotes that you're going to use in the exam. So I'm looking for 2 to 4 juicy quotes, and there's a reason for this, and it's going to come into number 6. So the next thing to do is, for number 5, my 5th essential, is to know the mark scheme. That means to understand that you're being marked for 3 things. The first is your ability to find relevant quotations, which is what the highlighting, the broad brushstrokes and the narrowing down will help with. The next is to be able to use subject terminology. I'm going to talk about that later. And then the most important thing for this question is to be able to make a comment about the language that you've picked out. And that's what helps an examiner decide on the level that they're going to place you in and the grade that you're eventually going to get. So you've got to understand that the comment is the most important thing, and that's why most of these essentials are going to be about the kind of comments that you're going to make. My sixth tip is to write 2 paragraphs. Like I've said, you've got 8 marks, it's 10% of the total for this paper. You need to spend about 10 minutes on it. Now, in 10 minutes, there's absolutely no way on earth, not even after 25 years of practice, that I could write about 6 quotes, 8 quotes. I just haven't got the time to do it. And coming back to number 5, when I know that in order to get 7 or 8 out of 8, I've got to be detailed. I can't be detailed when I'm writing a comment if I'm trying to comment about 8 quotes. I can do that if I'm going to comment on 2. So that's another reason why I say write 2 paragraphs. Okay, on to number 7. In the past, the bullet points that go with this question have been almost a straitjacket, that we've seen candidates who've crossed out the word could and written the word should, as if you've got to write about these 3 bullet points. Well, in actual fact, that's 5 things. That would mean that you've got to 5 paragraphs: words, phrases, language features, techniques, sentence forms. And actually, sometimes sentence forms can be really nice ones to write about, so I don't want to rule it out, but a lot of the time it can be really unhelpful, and trying to write about it can be really hard. So these bullet points were there just to help you know what language meant, and that just meant talk about some words. That's all I'm really looking for. And really, going back to the 2 to 4 quotes, if you can find 2 to 4 words or phrases that you can talk about, then that's more than enough for this. Okay, so number 8 is don't feature spot, by which I mean don't go looking at that piece of writing thinking, ooh, there's a simile, ooh, there's some alliteration. That kind of approach leads itself to really poor answers and poor responses, even if you're using really flashy terminology. And on Wikipedia, there are, I think, 2,000 literary devices, more than that, I think. So that means there are 2,000 fancy Roman terms that you could use from 2,000 years ago to help you analyse a piece of language. But they're not actually that useful unless you really understand what they're there to do. And I would struggle with that, even though I understand what some of those 2,000 terms mean. So there's no advantage in knowing fancy, ridiculous terms unless you know how they work. And I think it's much better to go and focus on, okay, well, what the main building blocks of language: similes, metaphors, personification, verbs, nouns, adjectives. With those, you can get a long way into the answer, and they will help you in a way, right? Whereas going out and saying, oh, there's some polysynthetic referencing or whatever, won't help you do that. Because number 9 is the most important thing, that comment is everything. The comment is the most important thing, and it's more valuable. It helps me decide on the level. So I'm not looking for fancy terminology. I'm looking for a good quality comment. I'm going to look at some ways that will help you be able to write a really good quality comment. So number 10 is learn a load of comment springboards. Comment springboards are the kind of little phrases that boost you into writing your sentences, to writing your comments. So they're things like, this suggests, this makes it sound as if, the writer gives the impression that, the implication is that. They're just those little phrases that help you start to write a comment. Because I find the hardest thing for me is actually getting some words onto paper, and these little comment springboards, and there are lots of them, these are just some examples, you'll find more on my website, but they really help you, and having some in your head as your kind of like go-to default answers will really help you. Number 11 is use those comment springboards to give a bit of way to open your paragraph. So this is to avoid writing things like the writer uses verbs to make the wind sound powerful. That's not a very helpful way to start your writing. It's much more useful to start with some of those little comment springboards and say things like the writer makes the coach sound as if it's blah blah. I put here at the mercy of the wind, and you're just giving a little bit away of the comment that you're eventually going to write, and it's not marked and it's not important, but it's just a different way to phrase your answer that help you get a better mark. And it helps, as I said, like a springboard, it projects you and propels you into better marks rather than starting with features. Number 12 is embed your quotations. Again, it's another of those things that isn't assessed. It's not in a mark scheme. Nobody says candidates who are getting 7 and 8 must embed quotations. What that means is that the sentence, your quotation is part of the sentence. And when you rehearse it and read it back to yourself in your head, it sounds as if the quotation is just part of your sentence. So when I read that aloud, the writer makes the coach sound as if it's at the mercy of the wind as the coach trembled and swayed. The words trembled and swayed sound as if it was part of my sentence, and that's what embedded quotations do. Number 13 is using those comment springboards to get you on track. So I used one in my point, and I'm using one after my quotation to help me start my response. So I've set myself up here with which gives the impression that, and that helps me for number 14. Number 14 is contextualizing a comment. So what we're doing on question 2 is we look at those words, and I've picked trembled and swayed here. And my first job is to think about, okay, well, what do they mean? Well, trembled, that could mean like shivering or shuddering. And so is the coach shivering? Well, trembling can mean shivering, but I don't think the coach is actually physically shivering. But I think shuddering might be a good word. One better would be the idea of it cowering, and I really like that notion of the fact that cowering makes me think then that the coach sounds afraid of the wind, and I think that's part of the meaning of that. So when I'm talking about contextualizing your comment, I'm trying to think about what does that word mean, and then what does it mean in that context? What does it mean in that phrase? So the word trembled could mean shivering, but a better word would be cowering, and that's what I'd gone with here in my comment. Number 15 is stick with it, because we know to get 7 or 8 out of 8, you've got to make a detailed response. And detailed means exactly that. It means you're not just giving up after the first little flash of something exciting. Now, the first flash of something exciting will help you get to 5 marks, but it won't help you get to 7. So getting to 7 is going to depend on you writing that little bit more and taking it that little bit further. So I look at my statement. So I've got here, it might at any moment lose control completely, and I think, what do I mean? And I try and explain it a little bit more. And so by sticking with it, I just mean explain it that little bit more. Number 16 is use your subject terminology after the quote. There's been this kind of pattern of using the subject terminology first, which is not very helpful. It's much more helpful to use it afterwards and to say what it is after the quote. So here I've just put these verbs in just after the quote, and it just makes it focus on language and makes it clear that this is about my understanding of the writer's use of language. Number 17 relates to that. It's trying to think about, okay, well, they've used a simile. Why is that important? You know, what does a simile help the writer achieve? And so what do the verbs do? And I'm thinking here, what do verbs do? Well, they're actions. So I'm thinking about, well, that's exactly what they do. They bring the scene to life, and they show just how out of control the coach was. And without those actions, I wouldn't be able to see, I wouldn't be able to visualize for myself. So I'm trying to think about why that technique, why is that important? And if I can't say why, I might not even use the subject terminology. Number 18 is to avoid generalized comments, like this makes us want to read on, this hooks the reader, because they're very low level and they come in at level 1. So I'm going to really go out of my way to avoid using those. Number 19 is to remember that top marks are detailed and or perceptive. So I've said about how we can expand on our ideas and get to detailed, but perceptive is another thing altogether. That shows that you've really got it, and that's another reason to only write 2 paragraphs, because in order to show that I've really got it, I really need to spend a little bit of time thinking about what this means, like I did when I was thinking about the word shivering, and why that wasn't particularly a good explanation of the word trembled. So that's what I mean by perceptive, is taking a bit of time to think about what this really means. And my 20th essential to really smash question 2 is to, I don't know what the technique is, it's probably not really that important. If I'm looking at it going, okay, well, I don't know what trembled and swayed really are, I'm not going to put these nouns because that's just going to show me to be a fool. So if I don't know, I'm just going to say these words, and that's my final tip.